Hey guys, tonight we begin with what might be the shortest geopolitical temper tantrum in human history. So go ahead and dim the lights, adjust your pillows, and maybe find that perfect level of cozy that makes you feel like you're floating on a very calm, very quiet ocean. Tonight we're drifting back to 1896, to a tropical island where a war started and ended in less time than it takes to watch a sitcom, if you skip the commercials. It's the Anglo-Zanzibar War, a conflict so brief, so strangely formal, and so utterly lopsided that it feels less like a military campaign and more like a very aggressive disagreement over an apartment lease. Let's just settle in and let the warm, humid air of Zanzibar carry us into the story. Now, Zanzibar in the late 19th century was a place of incredible beauty and, predictably, incredible tension. It was a sultanate, a spice-scented island off the coast of East Africa that had become a bit of a playground for European powers, who were, at the time, obsessed with carving up the world like a Sunday roast. Specifically, the British and the Germans were eyeing the place. The British, in their classic "we're just here to help" fashion, had established a protectorate. This basically meant the Sultan got to keep his palace and his title as long as he did exactly what the British consul told him to do. It was a great arrangement, provided you didn't mind being a glorified ornamental plant. The Sultan at the center of our prelude was Hamad bin Thuwaini. He was a reasonably agreeable chap as far as puppets go. He liked the British, or at least he liked the lack of being deposed by the British. He'd ruled for about 3 years, maintaining a delicate balance of yes sir and no sir to the British authorities. But on August 25, 1896, Hamad did something quite inconvenient. He died. Quite suddenly, in fact. He was only 39, and while some whispered about poison, because in a royal court you always whisper about poison, it's just good manners, the result was a sudden power vacuum in a very hot climate. Now, usually when a sultan dies, there's a protocol. The British would vet the next guy, make sure he was suitably pliable, and the spice trade would continue without a hitch. But Khalid bin Bargash, the Sultan's cousin, decided he wasn't really a protocol kind of guy. Khalid was 29, ambitious, and apparently under the impression that the British were joking about the whole protectorate thing. Within 2 hours of Hamad's death, Khalid had moved into the palace, declared himself sultan, and gathered an army of about 2,800 men. The British consul, a man named Basil Cave, was not amused. He sent a polite but firm note to Khalid, saying essentially, excuse me, you aren't the sultan we picked. Please go home. Khalid, doubling down with the kind of confidence only a 29-year-old with a palace can have, replied by barricading the doors and pointing some ancient bronze cannons at the British ships in the harbor. Imagine Basil Cave's face. He's looking out at the harbor where 5 of the Royal Navy's finest, including the HMS Philomel and the HMS Rush, are sitting, bristling with modern weaponry. And then he looks at the palace, where Khalid has some old cannons that probably belonged in a museum, and a wooden ship called the Glasgow, which was a gift from Queen Victoria and was mostly used for parties. It was like bringing a toothpick to a tank fight. Basil Cave sent more messages. Khalid ignored them. The British eventually issued an ultimatum. Khalid had until 9 a.m. on August 27th to haul down his flag and leave the palace, or the British would open fire. The night of August 26th must have been incredibly still. In the palace, Khalid's men were sharpening swords and looking at their bronze cannons. In the harbor, the British sailors were likely checking their watches and wondering if they'd be back in time for lunch. Khalid, meanwhile, sent a final message at 8 a.m. the next morning. It said, "We have no intention of hauling down our flag, and we do not believe you would open fire on us." It's that classic, slightly snarky royal optimism. They wouldn't dare. Because, of course, why would the British Empire, which had spent the last century conquering everything that wasn't nailed down, suddenly decide to be shy? Basil Cave replied with a note that was essentially the Victorian equivalent of "watch me." He said, "We do not want to open fire, but unless you do as you are told, we shall certainly do so." At 9 a.m. sharp, the clock struck. The British didn't wait for 9:01. They didn't do a countdown from 10. They just started shooting. And so began the Anglo-Zanzibar War. It was a symphony of wood splinters and smoke. The British ships were so close to the shore that they couldn't really miss. The palace, which was beautiful but made mostly of wood, started to disintegrate almost immediately. The bronze cannons on the shore were knocked out in the first few minutes. The Glasgow, Khalid's lone warship, fired its tiny guns at the HMS St. George, which was about 10 times its size, and was promptly sunk, though the British, being gentlemen, rescued the crew. While the palace was being ventilated by high-explosive shells, Khalid bin Bargash decided that perhaps being sultan wasn't all it was cracked up to be. About 2 minutes into the bombardment, Khalid exited the palace through a back door and made a run for it for the German consulate. He left his 2,800 soldiers and servants to deal with the British Navy's primary batteries. It wasn't exactly a captain goes down with the ship moment, more of a sultan goes for a very fast walk to the neighbor's house moment. By 9:38 a.m., the shelling stopped. The palace flag was shot down, and the British declared victory. The war had lasted exactly 38 minutes. Some sources say 40, some say 45, but let's not bicker over a few minutes of history. It was short enough that if you'd gone to make a particularly elaborate sandwich, you would have missed the entire conflict. The casualties, as you might expect, were somewhat lopsided. One British sailor was wounded. On the Zanzibar side, about 500 people were killed or injured. It's a stark, tragic contrast to the absurdity of the war. A palace in ruins, a sunken party boat, and a missing sultan, all before most people had finished their morning coffee. The British immediately installed their preferred candidate, Hamoud bin Hamad, who was so grateful he agreed to basically everything the British asked for, including the abolition of slavery on the island. So, in a weird way, the shortest war in history actually had a somewhat productive outcome, even if it was achieved through the most aggressive form of urban renewal imaginable. Khalid, for his part, stayed in the German consulate for a while. The British demanded he be handed over, but the Germans, who loved a good diplomatic loophole, waited for a high tide, rowed a boat right up to the consulate door, which was technically German soil, and whisked him away to mainland Africa. He lived out his days as a bit of a historical footnote, probably avoiding the sight of British flags whenever possible. It's a strange, dusty little story, isn't it? A reminder of a time when diplomacy was often just a polite word for having bigger boats. But as the smoke clears from the Zanzibar harbor and the tropical sun begins to set, let's leave the Spice Island behind. Let's float over the Indian Ocean, past the coast of Africa, and head toward a different kind of dysfunction. Because if the Anglo-Zanzibar War was about a lack of time, our next story is about people who had far too much of it. Let's move toward the French court of the 18th century, but not to the famous royals we've talked about before. Let's look at the sad, sickly, and spoiled, the children of the French monarchy, the little dauphins who were treated like gods but lived like prisoners. Think about the hallways of Versailles again, but this time imagine them through the eyes of a 5-year-old in a lace collar that's way too tight. Part 2. The Gilded Cages of the Little Dauphin. In the 1700s, being a royal child in France was a bit like being a very expensive piece of porcelain. You were beautiful, you were valuable, and everyone was terrified you were going to break. And to be fair, they were right. Medicine at the time was essentially a collection of vibes and bloodletting, and the French royal family had a genetic history that was getting a bit more complicated. Take the children of Louis XV. Louis XV had 10 children with his wife Marie Leczinska. 10. You'd think with 10 kids the palace would be full of life and laughter. But Versailles wasn't a home, it was a theater. The children were raised in their own separate wing, the Appartement des Enfants de Français. They had their own governors, their own servants, and their own rigid schedule of rituals. From the moment they were born, these children were subjected to the grand lever, the ceremonial waking up. Imagine being 7 years old and having 20 adults stand around your bed just to watch you put on your socks. They couldn't just go outside and play in the dirt. If they went to the gardens, they were followed by a procession of guards and tutors. The daughters of Louis XV, known as les dames, are a melancholy bunch. There were many of them: Adelaide, Victoire, Sophie, Louise. They were highly educated, talented musicians, and deeply bored. Because their father couldn't find equal royal matches for all of them, and he didn't want them marrying below their station, most of them. So, while the French princesses were busy drinking their body weight in coffee and gossiping about mistresses, a very different kind of royal disaster was unfolding in the cold, crisp air of the Swedish north. If Versailles was a gilded cage, the Swedish court was more like a drafty stone fortress, and the woman sitting on the throne was doing everything in her power to break the furniture. Let's talk about Queen Christina of Sweden. Now, Christina was born in 1626, and from the very start, her life was a bit of a comedy of errors. When she was born, the midwives actually thought she was a boy because she was so hairy and had a large, harsh voice. Her father, King Gustavus Adolphus, wasn't even mad about the mistake. He just laughed and said, "She's going to be clever. She's already fooled us all." Christina was raised as a girl king. Her father wanted her to have the education of a prince, so she spent her childhood learning how to hunt, how to ride a horse until it was exhausted, and how to stay awake for 3 days straight studying Greek and Latin. She grew up to be a brilliant, restless, and, let's be honest, completely unhinged intellectual. She had absolutely no interest in the traditional duties of a 17th century lady. She hated mirrors, she refused to wear jewelry, and she famously brushed her hair about once a week. She usually wore men's shoes and a man's jacket because it was more practical for thinking. Imagine her walking through the halls of her palace, smelling slightly of horses, her hair a bird's nest of tangles, and her mind on the metaphysical properties of the soul. Christina decided that Stockholm was far too dreary for her. She wanted to turn it into the Athens of the North. So she started buying up all the books and art in Europe. She basically treated the Swedish treasury like a personal credit card for her library. But her biggest purchase was a human being, René Descartes. Yes, the "I think, therefore I am" guy. Christina decided she needed the world's most famous philosopher to teach her at 5 a.m. every morning. Now, Descartes was a man who liked to sleep until noon. He lived in a warm, cozy bed in France, but when the Queen of Sweden tells you to come, you go. He arrived in Stockholm in the dead of winter, and the poor man, who was not built for sub-zero philosophy sessions, lasted about 6 weeks before catching pneumonia and dying. Christina's reaction was basically, oh well, who's next? She had a very keep moving energy. But the real drama was her refusal to marry. Her advisors were constantly parading eligible princes in front of her, and she looked at them with the same interest you'd give a piece of damp cardboard. She famously said that the idea of marriage was unthinkable, and that she could not bear the idea of a man using her like a peasant uses his field. Which, fair point, Christina. In 1354, she did the unthinkable. She didn't just quit her job, she converted to Catholicism, which was literally illegal in Protestant Sweden, and abdicated the throne. She dressed up as a man, called herself Count Dona, and rode out of the country heading for Rome. The rest of her life was basically a high-budget European road trip. She lived in a palace in Rome surrounded by art, scandalous rumors, and a collection of disgruntled popes who didn't quite know what to do with a cigar-smoking, pants-wearing ex-queen who kept trying to meddle in international politics. She even tried to become the Queen of Poland and the Queen of Naples just for something to do. She died in Rome and is one of the few women buried in St. Peter's Basilica. She left behind a legacy of chaos, a mountain of debt, and a very confused Sweden. She was a woman who was too big for her kingdom, too loud for her era, and much too interested in books to bother with a crown. Let's float away from the snowy Swedish borders and move back toward the center of Europe, to a family we've visited before but can never quite leave alone. We need to talk about the sad, sickly, and spoiled on a much larger scale. We're going to look at the nurseries of the Holy Roman Empire. Because if you think being a French dauphin was hard, imagine being a child in a family where your parents are also your cousins and your playmates are mostly doctors with leeches. Part 4. The inbred nurseries of the Hofburg. If we drift into the Hofburg Palace in Vienna, we find the Habsburgs at their most domestic. And by domestic, I mean genetically overlapping. We've talked about Charles II and his peppercorn heart, but the tragedy started much earlier, in the cradles. In the 17th century, the infant mortality rate for the general population was high, but for the Spanish Habsburgs, it was staggering. Out of 34 children born into the family over generations, 10 died before the age of 1, and another 10 died before the age of 10. These weren't just sickly children, they were the victims of a family policy that valued purity of blood over, well, having blood that actually worked. Think about Empress Maria Theresa. She had 16 children. Now, she was a much more robust Habsburg, but she treated her children like pieces on a chessboard. Her nursery was a factory for alliances. Her most famous daughter, Marie Antoinette, was just one of many girls who were raised with the sole purpose of being shipped off to a stranger in another country. The upbringing was incredibly strict. Maria Theresa would send inspectors to her children's rooms to make sure they were studying their languages and practicing their posture. If a child was sick, Maria Theresa's first thought wasn't always, "Are they okay?" but rather, "Will this ruin the marriage contract with the King of Naples?" The pressure was immense. Imagine being a 10-year-old girl knowing that in 4 years you'll be sent across the mountains to a man you've never met, to a court where everyone hates your family and your only job is to produce an heir before you turn 18. It's no wonder so many of them had meltdowns or retreated into eccentric hobbies. One of Maria Theresa's sons, Joseph II, grew up to be so spoiled by the idea of being an enlightened ruler that he tried to change everything at once. He issued over 6,000 edicts in 10 years. He tried to tell the peasants how many candles they could use at a funeral and how to bake their bread. He was so busy helping that he didn't realize everyone actually hating his interference. He died feeling like a total failure, asking for his epitaph to be, "Here lies Joseph II, who failed in all he undertook." It's a very heavy, very sleepy kind of sadness, the realization that all the power in the world can't make people love your ideas, and all the purity in the world can't make a family tree healthy. As the candles in the Hofburg flicker and die, let's consider the quietness of these palace nurseries, the sound of a silver rattle, the rustle of a heavy silk dress, and the long, echoing silence of a child who didn't make it to their first birthday. We've seen a war that lasted 38 minutes, a queen who dressed like a man to escape her throne, and a family that married itself into a corner. History isn't always a straight line. Sometimes it's a circle, and sometimes it's just a very strange, very tired person sitting in a quiet room wondering how they got there. So we've seen the girl king of Sweden trade her crown for a stack of books and a pair of men's boots, and we've peeked into the rather crowded, genetically repetitive nurseries of the Habsburgs. But as we drift deeper into the night, let's move toward a different kind of family drama. The kind where the siblings are so dysfunctional, they make a 38-minute war look like a polite disagreement over tea. Let's float over to the glittering, slightly frantic world of the Bonapartes. Now, everyone knows Napoleon. Shortish, hat-obsessed, conquered Europe, got stuck on a rock in the Atlantic. Standard stuff. But what people often forget is that Napoleon didn't just conquer Europe for himself. He treated the entire continent like a game of musical chairs for his brothers and sisters. Because why rule one country when you can install your chaotic siblings in all the others? Napoleon had 7 siblings who survived to adulthood, and to say they were a handful is like saying the Atlantic is a bit damp. He called them the Bonaparte clan, but they were more like a traveling circus of ego and expensive tastes. First, there was Joseph. Napoleon made him king of Naples, and then, when he got bored of that, he moved him to Spain. Joseph was actually a fairly decent, quiet guy who just wanted to be liked, but the Spanish people, who weren't exactly thrilled about having a Frenchman dropped onto their throne, nicknamed him Pepe Botella, or Joe Bottle, claiming he was a drunk. He wasn't even a heavy drinker. He was just the victim of 19th century character assassination. Imagine being a king who just wants to read his books in peace while everyone assumes you're face down in a vat of sherry. Then there was Lucien. Lucien was the smart one, the one who actually helped Napoleon take power in the first place. But Lucien had this inconvenient thing called a conscience, or at least a very stubborn streak. He married a woman Napoleon didn't approve of, and when Napoleon told him to divorce her and marry a princess, Lucien basically said, "No thanks, I'll take my wife and go live in Italy." Napoleon ended up scratching Lucien's name out of the family records. It's the ultimate "you're dead to me" moment, but with more velvet capes. But the real stars of the show were the sisters, Elisa, Pauline, and Caroline. They were known as the Three Graces, though the Three Terrors might have been more accurate. Pauline was the favorite. She was incredibly beautiful, pathologically vain, and once insisted on being carried to her bath by a giant African servant because she thought it made her skin look whiter by contrast. She also had a life-sized nude statue of herself carved by Canova, which caused a massive scandal. When asked if she felt uncomfortable posing naked, she famously replied, "Oh no, there was a fire in the room." Caroline, the youngest, was the most ambitious. She married Joachim Murat, a flamboyant cavalry commander who wore more gold lace than a Christmas tree, and together they plotted to take over Napoleon's throne while he was busy retreating from Russia. There is something profoundly sibling-coded about trying to steal your brother's empire the moment he hits a bit of a rough patch in the snow. Napoleon once sighed and said, "To hear my sisters talk, you'd think I'd withheld the inheritance of our father, the late King of France. He was the first person in his family to ever have money, yet his siblings treated him like he was a stingy accountant. They fought over titles, they fought over palaces, and they fought over who got the best jewels." Imagine a family dinner at the Tuileries Palace. You have Napoleon trying to redraw the map of the world on a napkin, while Pauline is complaining about her silk sheets, and Caroline is whispering to her husband about how they could totally run Italy better than Joseph. It's a very loud, very expensive mess. And as Napoleon's empire began to crumble, so did the siblings' loyalty. When the going got tough, the Bonapartes got going, mostly back to their private estates with as much gold as they could carry. It's a cynical, quiet end to the Bonaparte clan's dream. Let's leave the bickering Bonapartes and their stolen crowns. Let's float toward one last destination before we fully surrender to sleep. We've seen the kings, the queens, and the emperors. But what about the ones who lived in the cracks of history? Let's move toward the quiet, mist-heavy Dardens of the 19th century England, to a man who wasn't a king, but who spent his life trying to live like a ghost. Part 6. The Hermit of Welbeck Abbey. Now, we're looking at William Cavendish Scott Benton, the 5th Duke of Welbeck. Now, the Duke was one of the richest men in England, but he had a very specific, very quiet problem. He hated people. Not in a get off my lawn kind of way, but in a I wish to never be perceived by a human eye kind of way. He lived at Welbeck Abbey, a massive estate in Nottinghamshire. But the Duke didn't live in the grand rooms. Oh no, he spent his fortune building a vast network of underground tunnels. He had miles of them. He had an underground ballroom, an underground library, and an underground billiard room. He only communicated with his servants through hatches in the doors. He would leave notes, and they would leave his chicken and mash. If he had to go to London, he would get into his carriage at the estate, get the curtains drawn, and the carriage would be loaded onto a train truck, so he never had to step outside or see a stranger. Imagine the Duke wandering through his silent, subterranean world by candlelight, his footsteps echoing in the tunnels. He wasn't mad in the violent sense. He was just a man who found the world too loud and the people in it too bright. He created a palace of shadows where he could finally be alone. It's a peaceful image to end on, isn't it? A man in a tunnel, surrounded by his books, while the rest of the world carries on above him. As the tunnels of Welbeck Abbey fade into the dark, let's let the history books close. The emperors have fallen, the emus have won, and the monarchs are all tucked away in their marble tombs. The world is still, the air is cool, and the night is finally here. I hope these wanderings through the weird and weary corners of the past have helped you find your own tunnel of peace tonight. Sleep well, and perhaps we'll find another story in the morning.